our first panellist, which is Collin Constantine, a doctoral student in economics at Kingston University, whose field of study includes economic development and growth, international economics, inequality, political economy, and Caribbean economic history. So, please.
Well, good evening. Thank you for coming. All right, so this presentation is going to focus on oil and the expectations that come with oil and, of course, the familiar crises that are associated with the resource. The key argument is as follows. Guyanese citizens expect forthright increases in wages, particularly the public servants. Public servant salaries are very low in Guyana. Now they expect a rapid closure of the infrastructure gap, and by that I mean roads, bridges, airports, and such like. And you'll see in a few slides that Guyana has high income inequality, so there are significant distributional tensions, and rightly so, there are demands for redistribution. Now when you add political manipulations into these expectations, then you get heightened expectations, and this is typical of all oil resources and oil economies. Now, the key consequences that come with unmanaged expectations are as follows. Debt buildup, domestic debt, external debt. Now, you don't hear about this very often, but apathy due to unrealized expectations, okay? Apathy due to unrealized expectations. Now, if these expectations are realized, then you have excessive spending, and this can lead to balance of payments crises, exchange rate crises, and the familiar basket case. Wasteful public investment, and by wasteful I mean rapid expenditure in terms of capital works that exceed absorption capacity. So, of course, there's significant infrastructure gaps in Guyana, without a question. But our ability to close that gap within a limited period of time is limited. Now there's increased rent seeking, and by that I mean intensification of corruption if these expectations are unmet. And finally, unrealized expectations lead to distrust, envy, resentment, and economic crises. Now this is particularly dangerous in a country with a history of ethnic conflict. So the natural resource curves the political dimension. Now, I'm assuming we're all familiar with the natural resource curves, which is basically saying that a country that is rich in natural resources, gold, diamond, oil, what have you, tends to grow slower. What I want to say is that this relationship is not necessarily robust. It is true indeed that there is a resource curse in presidential democracies. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that the resource curse exists under proportional electoral systems. It is not true that there is a robust relationship between low growth and resource wealth in majoritarian electoral systems or parliamentary democracies. What we have here on the horizontal axis here is resource abundance as a ratio to GDP, and on the vertical axis you have rates of economic growth. This is what the resource curve looks like, a robust relationship between negative growth and resource wealth. And indeed, this is Guyana here. All right, this is between 1970 and 1990. So these countries have another thing in common besides low growth and resource wealth. These are all presidential democracies. Here, the curse disappears. These countries are rich in natural resource, but this robust negative relationship with growth disappears, and these are all parliamentary democracies. The fundamental question to ask is what is different between presidential democracies and parliamentary democracy? Now, the central hypothesis here is that there is better control over fiscal spending in parliamentary systems, simply because in parliamentary democracies, you can have the opposition change overnight. Votes can change overnight and you can topple the government. This not so in presidential democracies. Now, And the IMF, about a year or two ago, actually never mind, it's, yeah, two years ago, published a paper titled The Presource Curse. Now they found a robust relationship between the period of oil discovery and oil production and low economic growth. And they're basically saying that this is true only when you have weak executive power. Sorry, limited controls on executive power. So imagine a parliamentary presidential democracy where the Constitution ascribes enormous power to the president, like in Guyana. All right? You do expect low growth in this so-called period of discovery and production. Now the key channel here is related to unmanaged expectations again. So we've just discovered this oil resource. We're wealthy, we're rich, expect salary increases, expect expenditure here and there, but we have not received a dime on the oil revenue. So we borrow on future oil revenues. And that leads to debt buildup and interest payments, and during this very short period, we do experience what we call the Presource curse in terms of lower economic growth. Now, if you look at the data for Guyana between discovery and now, economic growth has slowed down, but I'm not here to say it's related to anything of the Presource curse. There are a number of things happening in Guyana. There is the barter arrangement with Venezuela that is no longer existing. There is the closure of the sugar estates, the sugar company, that of course will have adverse effects on growth. I'm not necessarily suggesting it's related to Presource curse. Now, save for the exceptions, and by that I mean Canada, the Norways, perhaps the United States, and a few others. Oil discovery increases income inequality and distributional conflict. Now, in the textbooks, distributional conflicts perhaps might take to the streets, all right? Union bargaining. In countries with ethnic conflict or linguistic and all the cleavages, it can take a violent form, right? And they should put pause on the people of Guyana. Now, when the initial inequality is high, and inequality assumes an ethnic profile, like in Guyana, now this is a recipe for disaster. This is how you get ethnic tensions and strife and struggle, and perhaps civil war. Now, in the slides that follow, I'm going to demonstrate some statistics for inequality for Guyana, Russia, and the Middle East. Of course, these countries have oil in common, right? I'm going to skip my comment on Botswana. Now, what we're looking at here are data for income shares, all right? So for example, in Middle East, the tallest bar, that's the top 10%. That is the richest 10% in the Middle East, right? And by the Middle East, we mean the geography of the Middle East. So this is data for 2012 to 2016. So as of 2016, the richest 10% in the Middle East appropriated 65% of household income. That's what that says. If you look at the United States, not very different from the Middle East. The richest 10% in the United States appropriates almost half of household income in the year of 2016. Now, this is a substantial concentration of income at the very top. All right? Now, we would expect that in oil resource rich countries like in the continent of the Middle East. The United States, well, that's a separate conversation. Let's look at Russia. Now, of course, Russia had this experiment with socialism, right? So the blue line, by the way, the richest 10%. I'm ignoring the others because it doesn't tell a striking story. The blue line, once again, the richest 10%. If you look from 1905, they appropriate 20% of household income, very small, nothing to worry about. But if you look at the early 90s, dramatic increases. And of 2016, the richest 10% in Russia, the so-called oligarchs now, they appropriate 4 to 5% of household income. I want to hit home the point. The richest 10% in these countries own half of household income in a given year, 2016 in this case. Half of household income. Now this is Guyana. Now, the recent statistic here is for 2013. The tallest bar here is the income share of the richest 10% in Guyana. And the data says they appropriate 41% of household incomes. All right? So that's very close to half. Now, we don't have data on by ethnicity in Guyana. So it's anyone's guess what is the ethnic makeup of the richest 10%. Right? Now, the other point to make about the Guyana case of 41% for the richest 10% is that it's not very far from the Middle East. So the Middle East is oil rich for a long time. All right, so there's a plausible explanation, there's a perfect justification for high income concentration in the Middle East. Guyana's initial situation is really, really, really bad. All right, this is what is frightening. Now, this is precisely why the political stakes are high for the different ethnic groups in Guyana. All right, it's particularly high. Now, I'm just going to do a very brief survey of the Ghana case. I was just having a conversation earlier about when I travel, people, when I say I'm from Guyana, they think I'm from Ghana, right? And what you're about to see, that the similarity perhaps extends beyond the name. Now, Ghana discovered oil in 2007. The national elections is in 2008. Production starts in 2010, all right? Just keep these key dates in mind. 2007, oil discovery. Production 2010. All right? So they have an independent central bank, meaning there's legislation that says the central bank is independent, it sets its own monetary policy, etc., like Guyana. There are two dominant political parties, fairly even political support, like in Guyana. They have a Revenue Management Act, and the key point I want to emphasize about the act is that 70% of oil forecast for a given year, 70% of oil forecast for a given year can be allocated to the fiscal purse. And they've established a stabilization fund. Now, Guyana has recently passed two legislations. One relates to revenue management, and the other relates to what we call a national resource fund, basically a sovereign wealth fund, okay? Oil discovery, 2007, production starts in 2010. Now, this is just fiscal deficits in Ghana as a percentage of GDP. Please note the enormous increase in the fiscal deficit from 2007. Total debt as a percentage of GDP has also increased, of course not as compared to the previous years, but it's certainly on the rise since oil discovery. Interest payments, same story, one would expect with rising debt in Ghana. From 2007, interest payments as a percentage of GDP has escalated. And you're about to see a startling statistic in a minute about interest payments in Ghana. In 2015, the interest payments on debt in Ghana was 9.5 billion. I promise you this is not a typo. I promise you this is not a typo. Interest payments, 9.5 billion Ghanaian dollars, not US of course. In the same year, the budgetary allocations for housing and water, agriculture, transport, trade and industry, fisheries, health, whatever, was 952 million. Please note the stark contrast between payments for debt and allocated to key sectors. Obviously, they were mistaken about their ability to pay, yeah? Recall that I said at the beginning, Ghana has a central bank that is independent by legislation. Now what we have here is the Central Bank of Ghana financing the government. I want to be very clear what I mean by financing. It could mean the central bank is selling its gold in exchange for US dollar and then purchase Ghanaian dollars and give it to the government. It could mean the central bank taking its holdings of reserves in other currencies, selling that in the market, acquiring Ghanaian dollars and giving that to the government. This is how financing can take shape, all right? And it increased dramatically since 2007. Now, economists recommend that every country keeps enough reserves, enough foreign currency at the central bank to cover 3 months of imports. All right? Anything below 3 months, it's an indication of crisis. Recall that production starts in 2010, discovery was 2007. Please note that the 3-month import cover at the Central Bank of Ghana declined since oil discovery. All right? And of course, this makes sense given the central bank financing. They were selling their reserves to fund government expenditure. So the Ghanaian story is familiar. Rapid foreign exchange depreciation, massive inflation, and please note that the central bank financing of government increased by 640%. And this didn't happen over 2 decades or 3 decades. It happened between 2008 and 2014. All right? Another point I want to make. I did say that the Revenue Management Act indicates that 70% of oil forecasts can be budgeted Please note, these are not revenues, these are forecasts. In 2011, the oil forecast was 1.2 billion Ghanaian dollars. Actual revenue was 600 million. In 2012, forecast was 1 billion. Actual revenue was half. Obviously, this is where central bank financing came in, to fund the difference, because 70% of those forecasts were budgeted. All right? Who are doing the forecast? Very important question to ask. All right? And that's the study. You can check for other details. I'm going to move on. So, how do we manage expectations? How do we avoid crises? I can say this now, and I apologize for my pessimism. The evidence is not on the side of avoiding crises. This is just a fact. All right? Do not seek solace in the case of the exceptions. Forecasts must be undertaken by independent analysts, obviously. Now, I did say Guyana recently passed its equivalent of a sovereign wealth fund, and they have an investment committee with experts. They have a macroeconomic committee with experts, and I'm saying experts because that's what it states in the bill. And these experts are nominated from the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, and a few other ministries. Now, I'm not saying that ministries in government are not qualified to appoint experts. I'm not saying that at all. Sure, they are. I'm just suggesting that the selection process for experts perhaps should be substantially more independent of political preference. Yeah. Now, injections and withdrawals into the stabilization fund or the sovereign wealth fund, whatever, should be based on technical parameters, based on a forecasting model, some kind of mathematical, economic type of equation, right? And we do have working examples. And the final decision should be determined, by a panel of experts, independent, meaning you shouldn't be appointed by a minister of government. A minister of government should not have the power to fire you either. All right? Now, obviously, we clearly need the upper limit on central bank financing. All right? Now we should have political consensus. Now, of course, this is the fairy tale part. So, of course, we should have political consensus on monetary and fiscal policies for the obvious reasons. Whether we'll have that is anyone's guess. Transparent redistributive policy. The United Nations have, I think this is the decade for peoples of African descent. And Guyana and other countries in the Caribbean have taken a number of initiatives to ensure that there is reparatory justice within countries for people of African descent. The problem with that, in the Guyana case, is that it's not very transparent. And there's always some kind of contestation underlying the whole thing. The point I want to make here is that given high inequality in the Guyana case, if you're going to redistribute income as you should, it needs to be done in a very transparent manner. All right? And the central bank must lead the communication strategy on how wage growth or the fiscal transfers or the goodies, how these things affect macro fundamentals and why they should matter for households. All right? The central bank, rather than perhaps politicians, should take the lead on this. It's important that unions understand what wage demand means. All right? And of course, these things should be communicated in non-technical terms. I do find it in the Guyana case that we're using all kinds of economics and oil jargon, all right, to perhaps confuse or to appear technical and sophisticated and intelligent, all right? And I think we do more to confuse than to inform the public in that sense. And that might be a deliberate strategy, and obviously we should agree to not do that. Now, there should clearly be a gradual approach to closing the infrastructure gap. This is very important. The easiest place to spend money is on building infrastructure, all right? The problem is we don't have the capacity to manage all these type of projects. I should have included in the slides here, but I did not. So, last 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a labor market survey undertaken in Guyana, and it shows that half of the labor force has a maximum education of primary school level. All right? Now, many of these workers, of course, are in government and other parts of the private sector. So the point is, there's no quality assurance for fiscal expenditure and infrastructure. Right? No quality assurance. And the last point I'm going to end on, non-political disclosure. Once again, this is a pie in the sky type of thing. Non-political disclosure of the facts regarding oil. We have many experts on oil, all right? And of course, the average citizen perhaps would not read the oil contract or the sovereign wealth fund bill, so they depend on the media for information. Now, you'd be surprised how many of the so-called facts are actually not facts, all right? But once again, with high political stakes, high expectations, and all that come with oil, I am not optimistic that any of these things will be done. So I leave it up to you. Thanks.